Good morning. My name is Ned Mumtaz. You have just joined the webinar on learnings from CMS Spend Submission. It's my pleasure to introduce the subject and the topic to you. We will have a panel discussion and we are underway. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please ask your questions through the panel on GoToWebinar. We will address them in the end in the Q&A section. You can ask the question at any time. It would get noted and recorded. Also, please know that this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to you after the webinar. Also, a copy of the presentation slide will be sent to you. Your lines as listeners are muted. Please note that all slides are copyrighted and may be used with attribution to the copyright holder. For anything related to the webinar for support, please call the phone number 832-220-3479 or through the chat box you can send a note to the GoToWebinar host. So with that, we are underway. One more point that I want to share is that there are four polling questions that we will share. These questions are designed for the attendees to share their feedback. So look for those. I will also, of course, announce them as those questions are made available to you for responses. Very quickly, just my quick background. I'm a practice leader at qordata. Prior to joining qordata, I have worked in the industry for around 20 years, and I've been involved in several different transparency directive related projects and programs, including deploying the solution for several manufacturers and providing advisory and consulting services currently to over 15 drug and device manufacturers in US and EU. And I have an expert group of panelists with me today. Here is our agenda. I'll shortly introduce the panelists and the topics, and then we'll be underway with the panel discussion. And after that, towards the end, we would allocate time for participant questions. So first and foremost, introducing the panelists. So I have Chrissy Bradshaw. She's a principal at Porzio, Bromberg and Newman, and also a member of the firm's Life Sciences, Compliance, and Regulatory Counseling Department. Chrissy is also Vice President, Regulatory and Compliance Services of Porzio Life Sciences, LLC, which is a subsidiary of the law firm. Chrissy counsels pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotechnology companies on issues related to state marketing disclosures and gift prohibition laws, and state and federal regulation of the distribution of trade and sample product, including PDMA licensing and pedigree issues. Chrissy is very knowledgeable and a dynamic speaker. I have had the good fortune to attend several talks and panel discussions that Chrissy has conducted, and I'm very excited to welcome Chrissy to today's webinar. Then we have two expert panelists from the industry. I'm very pleased to introduce Elizabeth Bodine to today's session. Elizabeth is a compliance analyst at Merz North America. She has been with Merz North America for over 2 years. She is responsible for HCP spend tracking, meeting state and federal HCP transparency reporting requirements, compliance auditing, monitoring, training, investigations, and sample reporting. Elizabeth brings pragmatic experience and expertise in the field, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from Elizabeth's broad experience. And then we have April Pierce. I want to welcome her. She is a transparency manager for global reporting at Shire Pharmaceuticals. Before joining Shire, she worked at Takeda Oncology as a compliance analyst. April also brings several years of experience working on global transparency and compliance directives. April has also has management experience for managing Shire's global patient organization funding disclosure. Again, I'm very excited to hear April share her learnings and experiences today. So with that, what I want to do is introduce the topic briefly to you, and then we will get started. An important disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed during these presentations by the panelists are of the speakers and panelists and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Shire Pharmaceuticals, Merz North America, or Porzio, or any of their affiliates. So today's panel discussion topics are: first, we will talk about best practices to follow after spend submission, advanced spend data monitoring using open payments data, identify outliers on the basis of benchmarks, protecting the organization from risks of audit and fines, and improve compliance programs using data analytics, and lastly, impact on processes, systems, and visibility from global spend compliance. So quite a broad list of topics, and we will try to move the conversation along so that we have time left in the end for Q&A. One thing I wanted to do as we started the discussion was to just level set and provide background understanding. It is possibly a safe assumption that most if not all participants have background in Sunshine compliance reporting and FPA transparency directive, but just in case someone is joining from a different stakeholder group, or maybe they have more experience on the US side versus FPA or vice versa, I would just take a minute to share a bit of background on these two programs before we move further. So quick history, beginning August 1, 2013, the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which is part of the Affordable Care Act, was brought into effect. It requires manufacturers of drugs, medical devices, and biologicals that participate in U.S. federal healthcare programs to track and then report certain payments and items of value given to U.S. physicians and U.S. teaching hospitals, jointly referred to as covered recipients. The Sunshine Act requires that manufacturers collect this information on a yearly basis and then report it to Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, commonly called CMS, by the 90th day of the year, which is around end of March of each subsequent year. On June 30th of each year, CMS then posts and makes the information available, and also and both participants, drug manufacturers, and general public can access it on their public website. So that's on Sunshine compliance reporting. Briefly on FPA Transparency Directive, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, abbreviated as FPA, represents the interest of around 1,900 to 2,000 pharmaceutical companies operating in 33 countries in Europe. The FPA Code on Transfers of Value is a set of self-regulatory industry transparency standard which requires FPA member companies and members of FPA member associations to publicly disclose payments and other transfers of value made to healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations in certain categories. Some of the examples of these categories are grants given to HCOs, consultancy fees paid to HCPs, and speaking engagements by HCPs and such. The first reporting period for FPA Transparency Report was from January 1 to December 31st, 2015, with the first public disclosure made by June 30th of 2016. So with that, and just one more summary, I'm ready to get started. This one summary is on the topic that we will cover around what type of analytics can be performed on transparency data. So this is just illustrative for the attendees. I would break it into two categories: an internal view and an external view. The internal view primarily represents the spend data that the manufacturers collect what are some of the types of analytics around the industry that manufacturers are performing. And here are some examples. One is an executive summary. This type of summary is helpful in sharing the internal spend with stakeholders around the organization. Another topic would be geographical, state level compliance. So in this instance, get a geographic view and then look at the spend from that perspective, and also apply the state regulatory requirements and look at spend from the state regulatory standpoint. Important topic that comes up with many manufacturers is spotting outliers and looking for anomalies or exceptions, and then also projections versus actual. On the external view, the manufacturers have an opportunity to compare their spend versus the industry. That can be used for fair market value comparison, competitive analysis with respect to either a region or geography, a specialty and such, and then also trends by types of spend across the industry, and certainly benchmarking one's own company spend versus the industry. And the last topic that we will touch on is around analytics-based monitoring. And what this graphic primarily shows is that you have public data sets, such as the one I just mentioned, CMS, FPA, Medicare Part D, and even subscription database sets such as data coming from IMS for prescriptions and such. And then you have internal data, which is a broad spectrum of data coming from spend. It could be coming from your accounts payable in financial systems. It could be coming from your compliance, data collection systems and such. Those data sets become available as the source for you to define alerts, and based on those alerts, look at dashboards to monitor compliance. So with those few topics that we would get into, I'm ready to get started. So panelists, welcome. I'm going to start with our first topic, and I will read the question. I'm going to ask our panelists to kindly share their feedback and guidance. So from a topic standpoint, what I'm looking to understand is, based on your organization's current experiences, are you proactively sharing spend data information with stakeholders in your organization? What has been your experience in sharing the information? What has worked well? And are there any pitfalls or challenges that one needs to manage based on what you have seen? So I'm going to invite Elizabeth Bodine to kindly share her feedback, and then April.
Hi. So my name is Elizabeth Bodine. In short, the answer is yes, right? So we definitely show all of our stakeholders both on a global level and at the regional levels. It gets a little bit hard showing the information to our stakeholders if they don't understand what the information is portraying and if they don't see the importance in the data. So from my experience, it's definitely knowing your audience and knowing what they're looking for so that you can take specific types of information that we get from the CMS Spend Submission to show them, like, yes, this is a little bit more of the KOL side, or this is how we as a company are doing, or this is how our competitors are doing. One of the pitfalls is if any of the data that I show them is not in their favor, they very much like to minimize the importance of the data or any kind of loophole, saying, well, that's not all of the data or that's not everything, when in reality it's the majority of what we're submitting. So we should take it, with a grain of salt.
Super. Thank you, Elizabeth. April, same question or set of questions for you.
Yeah, sure. So we do share our data. We share it with our compliance business partners, commercial groups, our executive committee, board of directors. There's been a lot of interest, and it's been really well received by everyone in our organization, and people liked it so much that they're trying to encourage us to move more from an annual summary to quarterly. So we're trying to figure out ways to show the data more in real time instead of waiting until right after we submit it to show what we submitted. I would say some of the challenges are, like Elizabeth said, knowing your audience and managing expectations, because some people want to see the data a certain way and some people want to see it another way, and that just, it can build a lot of work, and especially with a large data set, we have a lot of limitations in Excel, which is what we use to produce a lot of our metrics.
Okay, super. Thank you. Chrissy, any comments or guidance from your standpoint?
Yeah, I'll just add that, you know, your first question about are companies doing this, are companies sharing the data, and I think a lot of companies are starting to, and some of the companies that have transparency offices or a team that's able to really understand the data, slice and dice it, peel it apart so they can share it, are doing it more and have been doing it longer. But a lot of companies are just starting that process and thinking through what's valuable and then how to present it. To Elizabeth's point, I think a really good thing to keep in mind is how important context is. So when you're sharing it with your senior leadership or when you're sharing it with the business, making sure they understand what data you have and what data you don't have, and particularly if you're using the CMS data to compare or to show some benchmarking or analytics or comparative intelligence, making sure that folks understand the limitations of the data and the story that it's telling. The only other thing I'll mention, and really it's echoing what April said, that timeliness is a challenge still, I think. You know, you guys are collecting this data throughout the year in different sources, but it's often not until either the end of the year or the beginning of the next year until the data is really aggregated and clean and able to be sliced and diced and presented outward, and still very valuable, but it is, you know, potentially older than a year at that point. So just as we move forward, I think one of the things, the challenges that we can all work on is just getting that data more often, cleaner, earlier in the process so that it can be used more along the way. Thanks.
Super, thank you. So just to summarize, looks like our panelists, all of them, are in general agreement that there is an interest by stakeholders, and so both Elizabeth and April and their organizations share the data with stakeholders. There's also a representation that the group of stakeholders is getting broader and wider, commercial, compliance, board of directors and such. I think everyone expressed the importance of timeliness from several angles, both from the frequency of sharing the data as well as the currency of the data from real time to annual comparisons. And then lastly, with respect to challenges, a few common themes that I heard that echoed. One is that everyone likes favorable data, but they might get a little defensive if the data is not that representing their specific department or function well. So you need to be prepared to provide context. You'll need to understand your audience and managing their expectations. So with that, I want to thank the panelists for very rich and comprehensive feedback on it. Again, I would remind you that if you have questions based on what you heard or otherwise, feel free to send those questions in. We will be compiling them and then addressing them towards the later part of this webinar. So panelists, thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. And the next question is with regards to structure of open payments reporting in your organizations. Who collects the data and does the reporting? Also, if you can share key data accuracy and data cleansing processes that you follow. It is a topic of interest to many manufacturers, so some of your learnings and feedback would be helpful. And if you can also share advice on viewing your data or inspecting your data during and after the data collection and cleansing process. And finally, possibly share a couple of methods that have worked well for you, both in cleansing and inspecting data, and possibly a couple of challenges to avoid with respect to these components. So again, I'm going to go to Elizabeth first. If Elizabeth, you can kindly share your experience with these components.
Of course. So, and to answer who collects the data in our company, it's me. I collect and do the data reporting in our company, but the way that we like to approach it is kind of a divide and conquer. So what my boss actually put in place is that we have swim lanes, and we have identified each area of spend that would be the most important, and that we need to make sure that we have at least one person underneath. And then since some of those areas are still, they bring in a lot of data, what we do is we have that swim lane have multiple people underneath them collect, so typically one in each business unit or one with each type of device or any kind of our product. So when we have all of those, they come up and I make sure that I get all of our information every single month so that I can scrub the data first, and then I put it through third-party vendors. I typically have like a two-part process. So I get everything in, I go through it myself, and I make sure that it's all in the same template, that it's all uniform, that everybody's following things correctly, and that I can ask them questions right then and there, and that they can very quickly go back and get the information if anything's missing. I found that if you wait, if you collect it quarterly and not monthly, or if you collect it at the end of the year, it's really hard for people to go back and figure out, oh, well, I missed this, or oh, well, I missed that. So where did I get this information from? And the biggest challenge is then if somebody leaves who was collecting data for you, then you have to ask the new person, hey, can you go figure out where this person got this information from? And that's by far the hardest. So my two-step process is that I get everything in a month. I make sure that it's all completely the same in uniform. I create my own unique HCP list so that I know where HCPs are showing up and on what templates and from what swim lanes. So if they're showing up in research, and they're showing up in consulting, and they're showing up in Concur or from our food and beverage spend collector, then I know at the end of the year if I get a dispute exactly where to go to and when I can go to it. Then after I have it all put together, I send it out to an outside vendor. Right now it's QordAta. I also send it out to MedPro to make sure that everything is exactly the same. That's my process.
Super. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for that comprehensive sort of summary on your process. April, if you would be kind to share your processes within Shire.
Sure. So at Shire, the transparency department sits inside compliance, and we're actually a larger group, I would say. There's about 12 of us, and we kind of divide and conquer, and we have 3 core functions. One is collection of the data, one is validation of the data, and one is getting everything ready to actually report it. So I work on the end process of reporting, but I do work pretty closely with my colleagues who do collection and validation, so I can speak to a couple things. We have a lot of feeder files that come in either daily or weekly, sometimes biweekly. And then we also have a lot of third-party vendors, so we created templates that we have them fill out when they have data to send us, and we get those into our system as well. One of our biggest challenges is actually with the vendors and making sure that they fill things out correctly and that they understand our process and like what is reportable and what isn't. We go through this over and over again with them. We have to retrain them and like have one-on-ones to explain issues we're having with the data. So that's one of our biggest time-consuming, I would say, issues. For the data feeders, we do record count audits every day. So every time a file comes in, we make sure what was sent matches what we actually got to make sure we're not missing any data. For validation, we have a monthly validation, so all the data that is in our system at the end of the month is put out into a report, and we check it to make sure it looks good, that all the information that's required is there, we're not missing an NPI, or if something looks like incorrect data, we can go back to the spend owner. Like Elizabeth said, we try to be try to do it fairly quickly after they submit the data instead of waiting until the end of the year, because that does cause a lot of problems.
Thank you. So a lot of topics from a commonality standpoint that I noted, and I'll share in a minute. Chrissy, you have exposure to several manufacturers, and you provide guidance to them. Any key learnings and guidance from your standpoint, what you have seen manufacturers do in order to manage some of these aspects?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll just mention that from a benchmarking perspective, we mostly see the reporting sit under compliance or finance, and those folks seem to do the heavy lifting. But there are a lot of scenarios, like Elizabeth described, where there are business leads or folks that are in different business units or different departments that are responsible for collecting data and providing it to the reporting owner, whoever that is. And in a lot of smaller companies, that data comes monthly or comes quarterly or even, twice a year, just because the volume is smaller and is being captured in a template, a spreadsheet kind of thing. So we see kind of the full gamut between really sophisticated processes where data is being fed, it's an automated process, to really manual processes where an internal person is keeping a spreadsheet of a list of CME grants that they've provided, or investigator-initiated study grants, or funding product that has been provided to physicians or hospitals. So we see the process range wildly, but what I will say that both of these industry experts mentioned is the importance of kind of staying on top of the data, not waiting to the end of the year to do a review, to clean the data. And in part, I'll mention that because the federal report is the first report that we file, you need to leave a lot of time to do just the federal filing, the back and forth of getting your report ready, trying to submit it, pulling it down, correcting some things, submitting again. All of that alone takes time. So you need to give yourself plenty of time before that to clean up the data. And if you do that in an ongoing fashion, I think it can be much, much easier. And that's something that we're seeing companies do more of, another evolution in the process that initially, I think a lot of companies were having a hard time just collecting the data. So really all of the analysis and cleanup was being done in January, February, March. But we are seeing more and more advanced work being done on the data throughout the year. I know that a lot of the companies that we work with are finishing their state reports, so their July 1 reports are due very soon. So we encourage all of our companies to now, in the third quarter, really look back at the first 2 quarters of the year. I know everybody needs a break, but don't take too much of a break. Kind of dive in and start reviewing and cleaning up the first half of the year if you can.
Super. Thank you, Chrissy. So from my standpoint, I feel this is phenomenal, very rich feedback on a process that has been identified by many manufacturers as challenging. What I want to play back from what I noted is that in terms of the functional department that is focused on collecting, reporting, and validation, it seems like that both at Merz North as well as Shire, this is done by the compliance department. Elizabeth did point out that in terms of data collection, it's based on swim lanes by product, and so different functions also contribute with the collection process. Another common point that I heard was that with respect to the process for collecting, looks like templates do a good job. They are working out for both Merz and Shire. And then Chrissy mentioned that based on her experience, there are manufacturers who still use manual process, but clearly the guidance from the 2 industry experts was that templates have served them well. And from a data cleansing standpoint, again, common guidance that early data review is effective. It provides for a quicker resolution and early visibility. Chrissy shared that she's seen organizations use monthly, quarterly, or biannual processes for collection and review. It looks like Shire is doing it monthly, and Merz is also doing it very frequently. And then lastly, a couple of key points. Elizabeth mentioned that by tracking the data as it comes in, that lineage of the data is very helpful for resolution of disputes when they come up. And then lastly, April shared that one of the challenges that she has observed are vendors filling out the forms, sometimes not to the level of completeness that one would desire, and then that results in a little retraining as well as a level of follow-up. So thank you for that broad and rich feedback. Lots of points common, so hopefully our participants and attendees are taking notes in terms of some of the ideas and approaches that are working well for our experts. We would like to give the attendees an opportunity for a polling question. So the question that would be shared with you, if you could kindly answer, is the question is that the data collection and data cleansing process and the resulting quality of data used for reporting spend, is that satisfactory or not satisfactory in your organization as it currently stands? So my colleagues will open up the panel and share that question for you to address. We will give it a couple of minutes so that we can capture your feedback. I'm going to move to the next topic as you respond, and then we'll come back to your answers. So panelists, the next question that I have is again around spend submission, and from that standpoint, if you could share, where have you have had the biggest changes in your organization and processes as open payments data collection process came about. I think this process started in 2012. I know that the first submission was a little later, but initially that's when the regulation came about. So from that standpoint, unless organizations had experience with CIA or comparable mandate, most manufacturers were not assembling spend data at the level of detail that CMS has since required. So if you could share what type of changes your organization experienced to get this process going, what was the journey like in assembling the process and systems, and also key learnings as these process changes came about. Maybe April, if you would like to share your experiences with that journey first.
Sure. So actually, I started at Shire in 2015, but I do believe that gives me a different perspective as to what I wish they had done when they started. Something that we changed pretty soon after I started here is sign-in sheets for meals are now required. That wasn't something that was done before. And we also updated the sign-in sheets to include NPI or state license, and that's now required. So that helps us identify HCPs, which is something we were having an issue with without sign-in sheets. And also we created a checkbox for opting out of meals, because a lot of our disputes actually come from physicians who say they weren't at a meal. So now we're trying to clean that up and make it easier for our reps to report when someone doesn't take a meal. Something that I wish had been done back in 2012 when this was starting was maybe better documentation of decisions that they made, reporting logic, allocation logic, even something as simple as what data are we going to use to report travel and lodging. Stuff like that is good to have a really straightforward process and have it well documented so that when new people come to the company, they can see what you were doing. The other thing I would say is that my previous company, I did help a little bit in building, but it was a much smaller company. And our biggest challenges were working on creating a data mart so we could put all of the data into the data mart and have it cleaned in the data mart before it went to our reporting tool. And we tried to get as much as we could onto data feeds so that we would have less manual processes to work through. And like I said before, just documenting all of your decisions so that you can go back to it later when you're trying to remember why you reported something a certain way. Thanks.
Super. Thank you for that feedback. And Elizabeth, if you would kindly share your experiences in this journey.
Sure. So just like April, I started in 2015 as well. Although I feel like it gives me a little bit more of an expertise in it because I was kind of thrown into the process of reporting, and we were going through pretty big changes of who was reporting and who was collecting. And half of our collectors kind of left or moved to different positions, and then the person who was originally collecting moved to a different position as well. So from that point, I realized that we had to have backups to our trackers and backups upon backups to our trackers. So just in case somebody left, then it was just this really smooth process. And just like April said, the documentation is so important. I was lucky enough to come in and have all that documentation down. Couldn't find it right away, but once I did find it, I did realize that it was really, really helpful. Probably the biggest process and the biggest change, or the biggest challenge, is I made cheat sheets for everybody, because making sure that those people who are collecting understand that they are collecting everything on an HCP, or exactly what an HCP means, or exactly what it is that they're collecting, is so important. Because when you come into it, when one person thinks that an HCP is only an MD, and the other person thinks that it is an APRN, an MD, an NP, like all the way down to office staff, which is what some states require you to do, it's a huge thing to have at least something that they can look at saying, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is where I find the information, these are the dates that I need, and this is the type of HCP that I need. So we made a quick one-sheeter for everybody, and I fairly frequently sit down with everyone who's collecting to make sure that, yes, we are still all on the same track, and yes, we are still collecting everything, so we're not missing one or two things at the base level.
Super. Thank you, Elizabeth. Chrissy, you want to chime in with your observations in this space?
Sure. The only thing I'll add, you asked about sort of the journey that companies have gone on over the last couple of years, and one of the things that we have seen and continue to see actually is improving the data capture in Concur, or in whatever your expense system is. Mostly we see Concur. But that's, the dollar numbers might not be very high, but the volume of data coming out of your expense system is going to be high. It's just one of the largest pieces of everybody's reporting data set. And we still see companies that don't have either a customer master or a pick list in Concur, or they don't have first name, last name, state as required fields when entering an attendee. Something that April mentioned, having a place to identify if somebody did participate in the meal or didn't participate in the meal, so they shouldn't be included in the allocation or the attribution of the expense. So things like that we continue to see, and I think it really can make a difference in the work that has to go into the data after it's already been captured and sent in for your ag spend analysis. So I think that's one area that if folks are looking for something to focus on in this third, fourth quarter, take a look there and see if you can tighten up the data capture or put in place some little things, little changes to just improve the health of the data, so that next spring that piece at least is something that's less of a headache.
Super. So thank you so much. And like with any change, each organization experiences slightly different priorities and challenges. So what I heard is that a very common theme that you need to manage it very similar to a change management program. Both April and Elizabeth shared that documentation is important, documentation of processes, assumptions document, in fact, almost knowledge management level, because one can experience personnel changes, and that's when knowledge management type of documentation would come in handy. And then Elizabeth specifically called out sort of a glossary document that ensures common definitions. So looks like a lot of it centers around structured, thorough processes supported by knowledge and documents. A few other points that were called out were be prepared for staff changes and be prepared when that happens, that someone will need to be there to back up that information. April called out that they were loading the data in the data mart, so feeding the data mart, keeping the data mart cleansed was another new process that was there that they had to address. And then we heard some common themes between Chrissy and April around physician information capture, things like NPI, license number, opt-in versus opt-out in the sign-in sheet, improving data capture in Concur, be prepared for large volume. It may not be necessarily large amounts, but volume, and then certainly look for opportunities for data accuracy, and these are some of the examples that both April and Chrissy shared. So thank you. Rich experience, some very tangible, very actionable items that the panelists shared, so I want to thank them for that. Next, I want to move to the next question, which is around inspecting and viewing your data. So let me turn to the next slide. What I want to call out is spend analytics is being touted or identified as an area of aggregate spend where lots of organizations are closely moving and looking at. So what I would like to do is ask the panelists to share their experience and their organization's interest in analyzing spend data, maybe spend data around spend monitoring, compliance monitoring, and commercial operations oversight. So April, if I may ask you to go first again with these couple of topics, spend analytics, and areas where you're looking at spend data and analyzing it.
Sure. So on my team, there's actually other people who deal more with the analytics than I do, but I can speak broadly about what we do cover. We do use our data for meal monitoring, of course, both against internal limits and state prohibitions. We do use it for cap management monitoring. We use it for just trend monitoring to see what's happening, especially when we launch like a new product or something. And then just general compliance monitoring, particularly against our policy, against how many meals we're supposed to have a certain amount of time. We support our business partners with investigations, so if they need some additional data, they can come to us. We do have a CIA, so we help our CIA team by providing a lot of data to them. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the overview of our analytics.
Thank you. Elizabeth, your organization's experience with analytics and monitoring and commercial oversight.
So we use analytics for absolutely everything. I love analytics, and I know that if I have to go through and collect all this data, I might as well learn from it. So we definitely use it for spend monitoring. Just like April, we use it for meal monitoring, and the one thing that I love to use it for is for our state report monitoring. So for Massachusetts and Minnesota, Vermont, DC, Connecticut, all of those. I like to stay on top of that, and I like to stay on top of it on at least a monthly basis, if not even more, so that I'm aware and I can make other people aware, or I can make our sales reps aware if they're getting close to the limit, or if they're getting above the limit. Currently trying to get us to get a system that actually reports to our sales reps that they're getting close to the limit or above the limit, and hopefully I can do that with our sign-in sheets, because that would be the best. But we use it for compliance investigations. We absolutely use it for compliance investigations. and we're starting to use it a little bit more for marketing. Not as much, but we're starting to see how we can use it for marketing purposes.
Okay, excellent. Very broad usage. Chrissy, I'm going to lean heavily on you on this question because I suspect that you have broader exposure to a large number of manufacturers, and you might be able to speak to what you are beginning to see with respect to this expectation that manufacturers are turning to analytics to evaluate, analyze, and manage their spend. If you can share what you're seeing in the marketplace.
Sure, Ned, and I think it's a really good point what you said is that they're starting to do this, right? You know, that I think similar to what I said earlier, there are some companies that really are doing a lot with their data, and Elizabeth, exactly what you said, take the data, use it, you've got it in one place, you may as well learn from it and share it, which I think is great. And I think companies are getting there, but a lot of them just aren't yet. So it's I think right now still early, so early stage analytics, right? Looking for outliers in any area, you know, in consulting fees, that somebody's is really, really high. Why is that? Or somebody's is some very strange number, you know, $212.08, and why would we pay them that number? That doesn't really make sense from an hourly or meeting rate. So looking for strange, for big numbers or strange numbers, doing what April mentioned in terms of meal caps, you know, making sure that folks are staying within policy limits, company policy limits. So I think a lot of those things are starting to happen. I think from a compliance perspective, there's a lot of opportunity here. So doing speaker meeting monitoring, advisory board monitoring, looking at your internal policies and using some of these data as pieces of that. It's not the full piece of the monitoring that you should be doing, but it can be part of it and tells a part of the story of the activity or the event. And then I think, as we talked about earlier, using the data and sharing it with the business, I think making sure that folks understand what the data is and what it isn't is important. But this data, right, the CMS data is public, so if you're not going to share it with your business, they can get it themselves. And you sharing it with them, I think, gives you an opportunity to frame it and teach them how to use it in a compliant manner, because there are things that folks need to be careful about there, of course. But I think we're getting there. The only thing that I'll mention that is maybe a suggestion is that we will see, I think, more in maybe short term, but in the next year or so, I imagine, more feedback at the minimum from CMS on the data that has been submitted. I know a lot of companies received the letters in the early part of the year saying that you submitted something late in the 2014 or 2015 reporting period. So I imagine that CMS and other government agencies, the DOJ and state agencies, will be looking at the data more in years to come. So when you're doing your analytics, look at the data like they would look at it, and it might just be those outliers. But look at the total number of payments, not just the total dollar amount. Look to see, were there payments reported as travel and lodging that don't have a corresponding fee-for-service kind of payment, a consulting fee or an honoraria or something like that. So start thinking about it that way. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I haven't heard as many companies talk about doing analytics from that perspective, but I think there's an opportunity on that end too.
Super. Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you for that comprehensive guidance on it. So call out is that very similar to any new functional space where you have data repositories that begin to grow, organizations take different pathways and different levels of readiness in analyzing and managing that data. What we heard from April is that even though her department doesn't directly get involved, Shire is looking at the data from an analytics standpoint. Merz North, Elizabeth shared that there is a stronger and heavier emphasis in her organization and she, in her person, to look at analytics for spend monitoring, for meals, for state reporting monitoring, for limits on sales reps, and so forth. So looks like different organizations will follow slightly different pace in getting up to speed with analytics. It's certainly a function of capacity, capability, and priority. Chrissy shared a broad base view, which is that in her judgment, it is an early stage where clearly there are some leaders who are ahead and there are others who are following and getting there with respect to analytics. She also feels that there are some easy winners by the way of looking at outliers, looking at monitoring of speaker meetings and events, and then also calling out that in terms of comparatives, CMS data is there. Your business can certainly go and look at it at will if they so choose. And as a compliance organization who has deeper and better understanding of both the internal spend data and the public data, you may be in a much better position to frame that information and provide it to the business with proper guidance so that it is observed in a more effective, meaningful manner. And I think an important thing that Chrissy called out, and I had an opportunity to hear that directly from representatives from DOJ and CMS, is that there is a very heavy emphasis on the regulatory side to apply stats, to apply analytics, to look for scenarios and situations that represent questionable spend. And I think Chrissy very aptly called out that before anyone else looks at your data and looks for questionable spend, you have an opportunity to do so through analytics. So I think that's very broad and that's very comprehensive. So I appreciate the guidance from the panelists. I'm looking to see if we have results from our first polling question. So organizers, do we have the results of the first poll? If you can share that, please. So it looks like they're still compiling it. What I'll do is I'll ask the participants to kindly give us answer to the second polling question. And that question is directly related to this topic, and it is that, do you use tools to view or inspect your spend data during the spend data collection process? A, if you do inspect the data during collection, and B, if you do not inspect the data during the collection process. My colleagues would be sending that question your way for your feedback. I'm going to keep the conversation moving along just so that we have time for Q&A in the end. So I'm going to go to one more topic, and the next topic is around visibility of the data throughout the year. So how important is it to have visibility into your spend data throughout the year? Has spend analytics assisted other functions within your business? And how do you search for outliers and exceptions? In the interest of time, I'm going to really summarize some of the answers that we already have in this context. Looks like what we heard was that Shire was doing it on a monthly basis. Merz was doing it even on a more current basis. And Chrissy had shared that organizations are looking at the data monthly, quarterly, and some are doing it biannually if the volume is too high or if their department is backed up with other functions. So I'll try to see if I can cover one more topic before we open up the discussion for questions, and maybe just to give our participants from the international side, I'll take up this topic. Is your organization responsible for global transparency reporting in any of the regions, Australia, Japan, France, FBA, and others? And are there any efforts to integrate U.S. and ex-U.S. data collection and reporting with respect to staff performing both those functions, or processes or systems that go across? So, Chrissy, if I may ask you to weigh in on this first and what you're seeing in the marketplace.
Sure. Yeah. So this is definitely still evolving. You know, a lot of the companies we work with are here in the U.S., but have a sister company or a parent company in Europe, or many companies, other affiliates in Europe. And we have seen a couple of different models. We've seen a model where the U.S. organization that handles transparency, so the part of the company that handles transparency, handles reporting for everybody. And I think the reason is because they've had experience. They've been doing it for longer. So from a practical and experience perspective, they get the honor of handling it. We see models where the parent company, you know, usually in Europe, is managing reporting not for the U.S. but for everybody else, so in Europe and potentially Australia, Japan, wherever it might be. But I'll say the most common model that we're seeing so far is a more regional or local model where the local affiliates are responsible for collecting their data and then reporting their data in Europe, and as some folks I'm sure know, the reporting is different. In some cases you are sending data to an agency or to a portal, but in a lot of cases you're posting it on your own company website. So a little bit of a different process, and that's, I think, part of why in some cases it makes sense to do it at the local level. So with that, understanding sort of that model, the other two questions, I think you can kind of guess where I'm going to go, that right now we haven't seen the data for the most part being all thrown together and aggregated into one place and then pulled out for the different country or state reports at the reporting time. We've seen it segregated and managed separately for now. And same thing on the analytics front. You know, I think the data right now is often separate, but we are starting to see companies, and I think Elizabeth maybe mentioned it, that over time we're trying to get that data together so it can be shared globally and used for global analytics, shared with affiliates and parent company executive leadership and all of that. So I think we'll get there, but I think the global piece is a couple years behind the U.S. piece. So as companies continue to evolve on the U.S. side, I think that will just naturally happen too on the global front.
Super. Thank you, Chrissy. So panelists, we have two questions that have come in, and we have around a couple of minutes. So let me read the first question out, and whoever feels they have that experience with respect to the question may please step up and answer. So the first one is, what steps have you taken when the specialty, quote-unquote, specialist is rejected by CMS? Do you enter a specialty that is accepted by going by what product was detailed? So maybe Elizabeth or April, if one of you would kindly address that question.
I can answer that question. Oh. Or actually, April, please go first.
I was just going to say, our solution is pretty basic. We just decided to use general practice whenever a certain taxonomy code wasn't accepted by CMS.
Okay, so you have a default. Elizabeth, anything you want to guide?
So we actually ran into this year with actually one of our global team when they were doing it, and they ended up calling into CMS, and they were saying that specialist technically isn't a reportable HCP or a reportable specialty, but typically what we do is if it says specialist, if they have anything else, then we'll go down that list. Otherwise, we'll go off the VPL or what MedPro has, or if we can find anything else. And if it rejects it multiple times, then we typically take it out so that we can at least show CMS that we've attempted it, and then and it failed. So that's all we could do.
Okay. So I heard two approaches. One is take a default general practitioner as a specialty, or go through a process where you look for the specialist's designation or specialty in CMS, VPL, and MedPro. One last question, which is, what do you consider occasional for meals? Once a month, twice a month, there is no real answer, so I was wondering what other companies are doing. I'm not sure about the context, but if either of you feel you have an understanding of what this question relates to, I would let you address it. So
I can say that, oh,
go
sorry.
ahead. Please go
I
ahead.
would say in general, we have internal limits as to how many meals we can provide to HCP office, so we follow those standards. I'm not sure if that answers the question, though.
All right, so I guess the occasional was the frequency as you take it. Maybe that is the context, and that's based on your internal guidelines. So maybe there is no standard answer. It is a function of the compliance or the commercial organization defining the parameters. So we are almost out of time. In fact, we are out of time. I want to first thank April, Elizabeth, and Chrissy for phenomenal guidance and feedback. I know that this was a rapid-fire set of questions in a very compact time. I really appreciate you framing your answers very succinctly and comprehensively. Hopefully the attendees gained insight on some of these areas which we feel are common challenges across manufacturers and organizations. If you have more questions, please feel free to send those in. Those questions would be shared with the panelists, and then we will distribute the responses to all the participants. And as I had called out at the beginning, you would have the PowerPoint presentation sent to you, as well as recording of this session. So again, dear participants, thank you so much for attending. Panelists, thank you so much for your kind time and guidance on these topics. With that, I would like to close the session. Thank you very much. Bye.